Hello students, we're going to do activity 4 in sequence flood module, and we're going to start on page 1. But before we begin, we're going to talk a little bit about what this activity is all about. You'll explore two main hazards of flooding: inundation and strong currents. You'll use the Flood Explorer model to consider the impact of these hazards, as well investigate mitigation methods, that means stuff that can stop it from flooding, to reduce the impact. You'll also investigate how mitigation methods can have both positive and negative consequences for people living and working along the river. If it stops water from coming to your house, it might just shove that water down the river and it might flood at somewhere else, at someone else's house. Remember, a lot of people live along rivers in the United States. According to a study done by the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in 2018, 41 million people live next to rivers that are at risk of experiencing damages and losses caused by flooding. The study also found that more and more people are moving into these areas every year. So rivers are a popular place to live. The photo below shows the large and important inland port city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where two major rivers connect, forming an even larger river. In 1996, a major flood occurred in this area due to heavy rain and snowmelt. Luckily, there were no deaths, but the damage to the area was enormous. So let's take a look at this picture here, and we can see there's a little bit of green space here. But if we look along here, and there's a little bit of green space here, but not much. So if the river floods a lot, it's probably going to go into this major building, some of these buildings that look like schools or hospitals, major institutions. It might eventually reach the core of the city here, and it looks like a lot of people might work there. So there might be some significant impacts if the city is flooded. A flood is a natural phenomenon that causes hazards that can harm people, their property, and important resources. Natural hazards can create risks when they happen close to where people live. For example, if a volcano blows up in the middle of Iceland where no one lives, we don't really care about it so much, because unless the ash plume goes really high and planes can't fly around there, it doesn't impact a lot of people. But if it floods your house or your school or your business, then it really impacts your life. Zoom into the photo of Pittsburgh. If there were a flood, how might the flood impact people living and working there? Well, if you work in the middle, kind of in this area between the rivers, and that floods, you might not have a place to work. If you go to school, your hospital, your healthcare institution is over here, you won't have a school or healthcare. If you live over here, it doesn't look like there's too much of a buffer back in this photo. Your house might be flooded. So your home, your business, your place of education, or where you get healthcare, those all could be impacted by the flood. Considering the likelihood for another flood in the area, why don't people just move away from the flood zone areas pictured above? Their jobs are there, their families are there, recreational activities are there. Maybe you like to paddle along the river, or maybe you have a job working on a tugboat or a barge company. Educational opportunities are there. Maybe you go to college there. Maybe it's difficult to transfer, and just moving is expensive. You might have to sell your house, and if people know your house is on a floodplain or could flood, it might not be worth very much. One of the major hazards of flooding that can impact people and their communities is called inundation. Inundation is the amount of water that flows above normally dry ground as a result of flooding. You can see here, there's a lot of inundation. It's almost, the water is almost up to the roof in this house. Sometimes the flood is only a couple inches, other times it can submerge entire houses. The more water, the more danger. Look at the photo. The house is almost completely underwater. What are some of the ways that inundation, having a bunch of water come into an area that's not usually there, could impact the people living in this neighborhood? Check all that apply. Their furniture and clothes are ruined. There's damage to cars and other vehicles. Structure and walls become soggy and unsafe. Standing water can be polluted and make people sick. Roads are washed away. So check what you think is the correct answer or answers, and then you can check your answer. Now imagine a farm that was inundated to this level. What could some of the harmful impacts be to the farm? Animals will drown, like cows or horses, goats, pigs, chickens. Crops and plants would be watered. The grown food cannot be sold. So if you have a field of wheat and it gets flooded, or a field of lettuce and it gets flooded, you can't sell what's in that field. Tractors and other equipment would be washed clean. Chemicals from the farm can spread to nearby areas. If you live in an area that's likely to flood, what do you think you could do to protect yourself and your property from inundation? Some people have tried sandbags. Some people have tried living behind levees. Not all of that always works, but it's something you could try. It might seem like there are only negative impacts from flooding, but there are some benefits too. What benefits might flooding have for the environment? Flooding provides good soil moisture for crops to grow. Flooding provides nutrients to the soil. Flooding replenishes water sources. Flooding gives fishermen more areas to catch fish. Soil moisture is how much water is stored in the soil. Plants can access soil moisture by growing their roots downward to access water that's not right at the top. It's maybe down 6 to 8 inches, and they can pull that water out of the soil at a deeper level once it kind of dries off at the top. So you decide what the correct answer for question 6 is, and then check, and you can re-guess if you need to. So on the last page, you saw a house sitting in still water. Floods can also bring fast-moving water or strong currents. Watch the video below, which shows a town with a river flowing through the middle. A heavy rain caused the river to overflow its banks. So let's check this out. So the river, you can see, has overflowed its banks. It's kind of coming into a couple houses here. It's not so much here, but if it comes up any more, it might be. What are some of the ways that the strong current may have harmful impacts to people in this community? Check all that apply. Eroding the soil along the banks of the river, cleaning the roads, knocking down houses, washing chemicals into the river. The chemicals may be coming from people's yards or farm fields, carrying cars and other objects into the river. If you tried to drive across this river where it went across a road, that would probably not be a good idea. A rainstorm caused this flood, but it's sunny in the video. Explain how flooding can happen after it stops raining. Well, this one's kind of hard to think about, but if you think about, there are many streams and tributaries. A tributary is like a little river that flows into a bigger river. It may take hours or even days for the water from those other areas to get to a larger river. And it doesn't even need to rain where you live. It can rain upriver of where you live. So it could rain. So here in Minnesota, we live in the Twin Cities around St. Paul. The Mississippi extends all the way up to Itasca. If it rains up in Itasca and the areas around the headwaters of the Mississippi, eventually that extra water could come towards us and flood us here in St. Paul. And anything that's any water coming into a river upstream can flood it downstream. It depends on how much water and how quickly it comes into the river. Now we're going to watch the second video to see one way the National Weather Service tries to warn residents about flooding. Flowing waters caused by floods are very dangerous. Many people are injured or die getting swept away in the currents. So they're trying to convince people to turn around and don't drown.
If the water is flowing at the low water crossing, turn around. Don't risk your life, don't do it. You might not make it through it. Turn around. Might take a little time to heed the warning signs and turn around.
Okay. Floodwater can create strong currents in and around the river. What specific impacts were shown in the Turn Around, Don't Drown video when strong currents occur? Well, what happened to the white truck? It was floating down the river. What's going to happen to that person in the white truck? Do you think they'll be able to get out? Do you think they might get rescued? Should you jump into the river to try to rescue them? The answer there is no, because you'll get swept away in the current. These fast-moving currents with lots of water can push lots of things like trees or dead farm animals, boulders, parts of houses, and those things running into you, as well as the fast-moving water and the high water can kill you very easily if you try to go in a fast-moving river that's flooded. Even whitewater paddlers don't go in when rivers are flooded. So cars were swept away. The road was washed away. You don't want to be driving over that road when it just caves in. You also just don't want to drive in water because it can wreck your car. Water gets into cars and wrecks the engine. So there's a lot of things you don't want to drive across this. Even just 6 inches of water or less can sweep your car away. Why do you think the community leaders chose to create this video with a catchy song to warn people rather than a newspaper story? Well, my first question is, do you read a newspaper? Do you know many households that get a newspaper that are kind of young and brazen and might try to drive across a river? I don't know many people who get a newspaper delivered to their house anymore that they pay for, especially young people. So going to social media and creating something kind of catchy and fun is probably a better way to reach people who are going to be a little bit bolder, maybe a little bit more making bad decisions, more prone to making bad decisions, and reach out to them and go, hey, don't be the guy in the white truck. Don't get washed away. People can pass this around on social media and say, hey, don't drown, turn around, and remind each other in a fun and funny way. So, building barriers. As you saw on the last page, floods can be very dangerous. You might be wondering, is there any way to protect people and their communities from the dangers of flooding? There are. Dams, spillways, and levees are all used to control flooding. Levees are high barriers built along rivers that are made out of dirt, concrete, or wood. Look at the photos below. The top photo shows a concrete levee built along a river in an urban environment. The bottom photo shows a broken levee being repaired in a more rural environment. So here's a concrete levee kind of backed up with some earth. It's keeping the flood away from the urban area. Here's a levee. This looks like the one I used to live right next to. It's in a rural area, and apparently the water has breached this levee. It's found a way through it and washed part of it away and gone through the break. It's a levee that was breached in a flood near Percival, Iowa, June 20th, 2019. The levee is this grassy kind of wall of dirt here, kind of trying to keep the river on the riverside. Which side of the flood diamond does building a levee change most around the river? You can think about that one. Using your answer to the previous question, explain how a levee can reduce flood damage. So, can keeping the water coming into your neighborhood reduce flood damage? Think about that. If a levee holds back the river and it doesn't come into your neighborhood, it doesn't flow down your street and into your house, that's probably a good thing for you. We're going to figure out why that may not be a good thing for everyone who lives down the river, but it's probably a good thing if you live near a levee. Here's a picture of the flood of 1997 that affected Minnesota, North Dakota, and Manitoba. The river covered a huge amount of area. And towns not only were flooded, the building was flooded about up to here, but it also burned. You can see this is Grand Forks, North Dakota, and the water came up over the levee, and so the town was still flooded even though they had a levee. Levees are not foolproof. Since then, the town has taken many more precautions to prevent floods. They've built more levees and higher levees, and also adopted some kind of green areas around the river to just allow flooding. So not everything needed a levee. So that's an example of building levees. Sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Ever since Silverton became Silver City, the city's population has increased and new houses have been built. To support people living there, Silver City has built community resources, including hospitals, markets, parks, roads, etc. The mayor of Silver City is planning to build levees to protect the city resources from flooding. Use the Flood Explorer. You can experiment where to place levees along the river. Levees are expensive to build. Just like in the real world, you cannot build a levee along the entire river. You must choose which areas to protect with levees. Before placing levees, investigate which areas are prone to flood during a long storm with heavy rain when the starting water is high. So let's go and figure out. We have heavy rain, we have a long storm, and the starting water level is high. So let's let this run here and let's see what floods so we can figure out what we need to protect. So we can see there are some areas of the city that are flooding. Let's back up here to maximum flooding. So we can see all of Highway 8 here is flooded. The airport is inaccessible. Bend Elementary has been flooded. The retirement village has been flooded. It's going to be very difficult to get to the hospital because many of the roads and streets around the hospital are flooded. Hidden Valley Farms is impacted. Folks might have a hard time getting to the grocery store. It's not actually flooded, but it's flooded around the grocery store. So we have to think about where we want to put levees in here. Which of the following places are likely to experience flood damage in a long storm with heavy rain? The airport, Brookside University, Bend Elementary, the grocery store, or retirement village. So which of these areas actually have water over them? In order to place levees in Flood Explorer, click the levee icon right here. Click on the dotted red lines along the riverbanks to place a stretch of levees. You can remove the levee if you click on that location again. Place as many levees as necessary, up to 10, to protect the Silver City Hospital. So it's our job right now to protect the hospital. So let's click levee, and let's click around the hospital here. And we need to protect enough of the hospital around the hospital to make sure that water doesn't like sneak around the bend here and flow into the city and inundate the hospital. So we have to put levees upstream, and we have to put levees downstream as well to make sure the water just doesn't, if we didn't put this levee here, the water might just pour out right here and flood areas around the hospital, which would make it hard to get to the hospital. So maybe we should put a couple more levees here. We've used up 5 of our levees. We can use 5 more. We might want to think about protecting the airport. We could think about protecting the retirement village. Oh, I don't have any left. Probably want to unclick this one and click this one. Bend Elementary might be kind of out of luck. We'll see what happens when we rerun this with the levees. So let's make sure we've got heavy rain, storm duration is long, starting water level is high. So let's restart this run here. Let's look at the general graph here. So we're running the same conditions as we did before, but we're running them with levees in. And probably it might not reduce the total number of acres flooded, but it might reduce the damage done by the flood. It looks like we've protected the hospital pretty well. The retirement village still has some water in it. Bend Elementary is still pretty wet, but we did manage to protect the hospital, which was our priority. So we need to take a snapshot. And we can see we were pretty successful at least protecting the hospital. We can't protect everyone. We didn't have enough money to build levees everywhere. Using the evidence from the snapshot, explain how the location of the levees affected the hospital and the area across the river. So probably, if you look carefully, let's go up to our model here and we can kind of zoom in. If you look at the hospital, it probably flooded a little bit more on the other side. If I was a resident of West Silver City here, I might be kind of mad that they built levees over here to protect the hospital, because that means I get more water in my neighborhood. So when you're building levees, you have to figure out where that water is going to go. If it's not going to go into town, where else might it flood? So we protected the hospital, but West Silver City was more flooded because the water went to the other side of the river. Okay, so let's look again at the map of Silver City. If the city could only afford to build levees to protect one other location in Silver City, which location should they protect? Bend Fields, which looks like just a park or maybe some soccer and baseball fields, the grocery store, Bend Elementary, the retirement village, or Waterworks Park? There are a lot of correct answers to this question. You just need to justify your answer. So if you really think it should be Bend Fields, you need to tell us why that's important, or more important than the grocery store, or the elementary school, or the retirement village. Maybe Waterworks Park is important because maybe the waterworks needs to be protected from floodwaters. It depends on how the city manages its water. We'll see you in part 2 for activity 4 next time. This is Dr. B signing off in the flood module, activity 4, part 1.